All of you watching on PBS and around the globe, a warm welcome to BBC World News. We start in Ukraine, where officials say a critical infrastructure facility near the capital, Kyiv, has been hit by Russian strikes. Ukrainian media reported at least 3 explosions. There's no information on casualties. There's also been shelling in the southern city of Mykolaiv. Meanwhile, at the United Nations in New York, in a symbolic vote, around 3/4 of the General Assembly nations voted to condemn what was described as Russia's attempted illegal annexation of 4 partially occupied regions in Ukraine. The motion, which isn't internationally binding, also called on all countries not to recognise the annexation. This is the way the vote was tallied. Of the 193 General Assembly members, 143 voted to condemn Russia, 35 abstained, and 5, including Russia and Belarus, voted against. Let's go live to Ukraine now and talk to Hugo Bashega, who's there for us in Kyiv. And Hugo, tell us about the latest strikes on Ukraine.
Yeah, Carrie, let me start with what happened here in the region of Kyiv. The governor said a village was hit in the early hours of the morning. He said this attack was caused by a so-called kamikaze drone, which is a drone that has been provided by the Russians to by the Iranians to the Russians, and Russian forces have been using those drones to target places across the country. And in the city of Mykolaiv, in the south of the country, officials say 1 person was killed after a residential area of the city was hit by Russian shelling overnight. The mayor said the rescue efforts are still underway. 6 people are still missing after this attack. Mykolaiv has been frequently targeted by Russian forces. It is relatively close to the front lines in the south of the country. Now, the Ukrainians have been saying that this is how Russia is reacting to its recent military defeats by attacking civilian sites and civilian infrastructure across the country. But as we talk about the recent military developments here in this country, I think we all remember the siege of the Azovstal steelworks in the city of Mariupol. Hundreds of Ukrainian fighters were taken as prisoners of war by Russia, and many here believe that they will never be released. So it was a major surprise when a prisoner swap happened last month, and top members of the Azov regiment from Mariupol were released. They were described as neo-Nazis, as terrorists in Russia, and many were defending harsh penalties, including the execution of those prisoners. Some of them are now here in Kyiv, and I've been speaking with Ilya Somailenko, one of the key Azov fighters who have been released, and he's been telling me about the destruction in Mariupol.
They've been destroying civilian blocks. We've seen this with our own eyes, and we were like, it's hard to understand why they're doing this. We were just doing our job, and we were trying to make it as best as possible. We had nowhere to retreat because we were encircled. Thousands of our comrades, battle brothers, they're still captured. We should not ask the people who returned from being captured, who returned back, about the details, because the details, well, this is obvious things, obvious things that people who are captured, that they are tortured by the Russians. Well, I just been in solitude for 4 months in like relatively normal conditions. I knew this from the guys in Olenivka, that with each new week their conditions became worse and worse. You just can, find some videos on the web about the conditions in Russian prison, just for the regular prisoners, and multiply this by 2, and this will be like the conditions in the Russian prison camp for prisoners of war. They don't give a care about the rules of war. They don't give a care about the Geneva Committee statements. They don't give a care about the lives of the people.
Most people thought that it would never be released. Did you think that you could be released?
When it was captured, it was a very big chance for us to stay in Russia and never came back. It was extremely huge. So
you're prepared for that?
Yeah, we were prepared.
Was there any moment that you just sort of, you had lost hope that you would be released and returned to Ukraine?
You should never lose your hope, but the hope should not obstruct your vision and perception of reality.
How has it been with the family for the first time?
It was, well, like after all this time, it's happy to see like my beloved ones. It's happy to see my friends. It's happy to see the people who've been waiting for me. But it's bittersweet moment because I know that hundreds of families still waiting for their warriors. The Russians still torturing them, still keeping them in the inhumane conditions, and that's why it's our top priority right now. It's to restore ourselves, to return to the battlefield, and we have to return as a solid unit because we have to take our boys back.
So that's Ilya Somailenko, who was one of the Azov fighters released in this prisoner exchange. And Karin, this was a source of celebration here because nobody really thought that these fighters would ever be seen again here in Ukraine.
Incredible series of events watching what happened there. Hugo, while we have you, we're just looking at pictures from Strasbourg where the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg is being addressed live by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who we can see here talking via video link from Kyiv. Now, I'm just told we do have translation of what he's going to be saying. Let's just listen in briefly.
8 years of war in Donbass. I think you're well informed about what Ukrainians have to live through these days, because in the European media there is no shortage of information about specific manifestations of the Russian terror and about the course of this war. The Ukrainian delegation at the Parliamentary Assembly is working quite effectively, stressing what is important for Ukraine and for all of Europe. So I won't take your time to tell you about the new targets of the Russian terrorists and the events at the front line. I want to focus on something else, on how and when we will be able to put an end to these days, when the war will end, when peace will come, when our territorial integrity, peace and quiet will come back to the Ukrainian land. I remember when I became President of Ukraine in 2019, our country had quite difficult relations with the Council of Europe, because then the Russian delegation had come to the Parliamentary Assembly. In fact, it was an attempt to forget everything that Russia had done against Ukraine and European values starting with 2014. Forget it by covering it with the ideas that allegedly one had to keep up the dialogue with Russia on all possible levels. Then the word dialogue camouflaged the desire to just ignore the reality. And even worse, that word camouflaged the desire of some actors to get a part of the corrupt money flow from Russia to Europe that had already caused many troubles in the European politics. This year there is nothing like that any longer, and I'm really grateful to you for that, really grateful. When Russia started its
Well, there we are, President Zelensky, as he does so frequently, addressing parliaments and organisations around the world. The Council of Europe is an international organisation founded after World War II to uphold human rights, democracy and the rule of law in Europe. Hugo is still with us. And Hugo, I mean, we hear from President Zelensky very regularly, but given what has happened in Ukraine over recent days, given Russia's actions, so many Ukrainian cities targeted, what is his message likely to be this time?
Yeah, I think the president has been very clear that what the Ukrainians need is air defense capabilities. They think that this is the kind of technology they need to protect cities and towns across the country from the threat of Russian missiles. And I think he's been saying that what happened on Monday is proof that the Ukrainians need to be provided with this kind of technology. And after those attacks on Monday, President Biden Biden said that the United States would provide the Ukrainians with this kind of technology. Germany has delivered some equipment for that to happen. And today we had an announcement from the British Defence Secretary saying that the UK would give air defence missiles to Ukraine, and those rockets would be able to destroy cruise missiles. So I think this is the kind of message that the Ukrainians have been sending to Western countries, that they need this kind of equipment and technology to protect cities from the threat posed by Russian missiles.
Hugo, thank you very much. Hugo Bashega, thanks for staying with us, Hugo, for that hearing from President Zelensky. Now let's stay on this theme because NATO defence ministers are meeting in Brussels for a second day to discuss their ongoing response to the war in Ukraine. At the head of the table, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin. They spoke to the media on their way in to the gathering.
We will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will step up our support, and in particular, we will provide more air defense systems to Ukraine.
I want to applaud all of our allies and partners who've stepped up to provide assistance to Ukraine. You know, Russia is in this 8th month of its unprovoked and unjust invasion of Ukraine, and since it's done that, allies have continued to step up to provide security assistance.
Well, let's talk to Jessica Parker, our correspondent who joins us live from Brussels. And Jess, NATO's solidarity with Ukraine continues as ever, but what has been announced by way of help that is tangible and new?
Yeah, so, I mean, Hugo was just outlining some of what we've heard over the past few days, including a pledge overnight from the UK for AMRAAM rockets capable of shooting down cruise missiles. The UK government, though, hasn't said how many of these they would send. They're pretty expensive bits of kit described as cutting edge by the government. They're saying those will be delivered within the coming weeks. So it's not an exact timeline, but what's interesting is they are due to be paired with some air defence systems that the United States is going to be sending, and the US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin was asked about when those air defence systems are going to be delivered to Ukraine last night by quite an emotional Ukrainian journalist who was saying that his family couldn't sleep at night. He'd been in Kiev earlier in the week when, of course, Russia decided to go ahead with missile attacks, and Lloyd Austin's response was that they would get those systems to Ukraine as soon as possible. And I think when you hear these pledges of support, whether it's from the Netherlands, whether it's from Germany, the United States, the UK, there's always this question of when will these weapons actually arrive. And one of the things that defence ministers are talking about last night into today is also around procurement, because countries have been supplying weapons to Ukraine. They've also found that their own stocks have been depleted. And actually, we've seen this morning an announcement that 13 NATO allies have signed a letter around an intent for joint procurement on air defence systems.
Just briefly, very interesting to hear what Lloyd Austin said as he was going in. Something else he said was every inch of NATO territory will be defended if it comes to it under Article 5 obligations. I imagine that's designed to send a message to President Putin, but also, I'd imagine, to reassure those NATO member states who border Russia and right now feel particularly vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, worth pointing out, many people will know this, but of course, Ukraine isn't in NATO, but there are 30 countries that are, and they include some of those countries on that eastern flank, which they've been reinforcing in terms of presence there. And I think you're right, that absolutely is designed to send a message. There's messages kind of coming out of this summit that are about solidarity for Ukraine, but also as well, you're right, saying that they will protect every inch of NATO territory. So I think those messages will keep coming from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, who we should hear from again later today. But the other thing that they've been talking about, it's not just about protecting sort of land territory, but critical infrastructure as well, following, for example, the suspected sabotage of those Nord Stream gas pipelines. So they're looking at protecting territory, but also those vital pieces of infrastructure that keep the West running.
Jess, thanks very much. Jessica Parker there at the NATO meeting in Brussels. Well, President Putin arrived in Kazakhstan earlier for a regional summit there, and what are expected to be a series of one-to-one meetings. The gathering is known as the Conference on Interaction and Confidence-Building Measures in Asia. Among the leaders expected to have some one-to-one time with President Putin, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who, according to the Kremlin, will raise ideas for peace in Ukraine. There is so much more about the war in Ukraine on the BBC website. There's a special section looking at all the developments, comments from all of the main figures. It's fact-checked, it's analysed by experts, bbc.com/news, or you can access all of that too via the BBC News app.
A retired military commander has told the BBC Taiwan would be unable to resist the use of force by an increasingly assertive China. It follows a warning by the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken that Beijing is pursuing unification on a much faster timeline than previously thought. Our correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes has been to the Taiwanese island of Jinmen to assess the growing threat.
The island of Jinmen is so close to China, they used to blast anti-communist propaganda from these giant speakers to people living on the Chinese coast. It all looks peaceful today, a tourist curiosity. But twice in the last 70 years, China has tried to cross these narrow straits. The island is still a fortress covered in tunnels, bunkers and lookouts.
So the main island of Taiwan is 150 kilometers away from here across the Taiwan Strait. But this is the real front line between Taiwan and mainland China. Because take a look at this. This across here is the Chinese city of Xiamen, one of the wealthiest cities in China. And this behind me here, this is the Taiwanese military outpost called Lion Rock. And it's from here that a Chinese drone flew over the top of this outpost on September the 1st, and they shot it down.
The last time Chinese troops tried to come up these beaches, they were no match for Taiwan's forces. But retired Colonel Chen Shuicai says today it would be completely different. Now it's the opposite, he says. The gap between China's military power and Taiwan's is getting bigger and bigger. Their military power is getting stronger and stronger. If Xi Jinping is determined to use military force, then Taiwan can't stop them. In July, Taiwan put on this huge military drill. It's aimed to show how well prepared the island is to fend off a Chinese attack. Instead, critics say it showed how vulnerable Taiwan's forces are to a bigger, more modern, more heavily armed foe. One of the fiercest critics is the man who used to command Taiwan's armed forces.
If we remain unchanged, we will be defeated, certainly, no doubt about it. I urge the government, you got to take action. You have to take action right now. We don't have time to consider or research or study it again and again. The time is not on our side.
Man down, man down, man down! Admiral Lee is not the only one to feel the sense of urgency. Thousands of civilians are joining training programs like this one to learn how to fight if war comes. Like all the young men here, Jay Lai has done his military service, but he says it taught him nothing about real fighting.
No, we didn't learn anything about the rifle or gun, no. But you learn about concept. But I never touched a gun in 11 months.
When you live with a threat so close for so long, it's easy to become complacent, to believe it won't happen. But as Admiral Lee put it to me, no country can rely on the kindness of its enemy. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News in Taiwan.
Rescuers in Turkey are digging through rock to try to reach 15 people trapped underground after an explosion at a coal mine. At least 28 people are thought to have died in the blast in Amasra on the Black Sea coast. Initial reports suggest it had been caused by a build-up of flammable gases. Russell Trott reports.
The rescuers show no sign of letting up. Dropped 300 metres or nearly 1,000 feet down into the darkness in a race against time. Crowds gathered around the head of the mine shaft at Amasra in northern Turkey. Some were family members of the dead and injured. Quietly, dignified, awaiting news from those digging through the rock. The details have yet to be fully revealed. An initial assessment was that methane gas had somehow ignited.
110 of our brothers were working in the mine. Some of them, the ones on the upper level, managed to exit right after the explosion. Some others have been rescued. At the moment, people are being transferred to the hospital.
Mining-related accidents happen all over the world. It's one of the riskiest of jobs. This latest incident is said to have taken place in one of the facility's high-risk zones. President Erdogan is expected to visit the site on Saturday. The local prosecutor's office has begun an investigation into what happened at this state-owned mine and try to find ways of preventing it from ever happening again. Russell Trott, BBC News.
Well, let's stick with this story and get more with Ruth Michelson, a reporter for The Guardian, who is in Istanbul. Thank you for joining us, Ruth. It is mid-morning there, and this is a story that is developing minute by minute. What more can you tell us?
Well, we know that rescue workers have been working through the night since the explosion occurred about 6:45 p.m. yesterday to try and rescue dozens of people who are still trapped inside the mine. We know that the Interior Minister, Süleyman Soylu, said earlier today that there were 110 people inside the mine at the time of the explosion. And it's unclear how many of them are still trapped. There were 49 who were particularly trapped inside a high-risk area of the facility, he said. But it's not clear how many of those people now have been rescued from the inside.
So a worrying situation, and like I said, developing ongoing. We know some people have been rescued. What do we know about their condition?
Well, we know that there are the ones that have been rescued have been taken to hospitals locally, and some have been taken airlifted to hospital here in Istanbul. The members of the government have said that there is no current risk to life to 11 of them that have been brought here to Istanbul. But obviously there are concerns about those who are still trapped inside the mines, and concern about that the death toll is going to rise from 28, given that this has now been going on, well into the next day, given that this occurred late last night.
And we have been hearing from Turkey's finance minister, because whilst that rescue operation goes on, people will want answers immediately. What has he been sharing about the potential cause?
Well, the potential cause so far, as you mentioned, the finance minister's statement has been cited as a fire damp explosion. So that's a buildup of explosive gases that can occur inside the mine. And there are certainly questions, given that this was a state-owned mine, about what was known about the safety of the mine beforehand. Given that mining explosions, as you mentioned in the piece earlier, they occur all over the world. But for example, the head of the independent mining business union spoke to the opposition Cumhuriyet and said, we've experienced a number of major mining disasters in Turkey, notably in 2014 in the town of Soma, where 301 people died. And he said there are mines all over the world, but these disasters always occur in mines in Turkey.
Interesting. And on that subject, I know that President Erdogan is heading to the impacted area, to that Black Sea coast area where that mine is. But with regards to resources, does the country have the sufficient capacity to tackle a crisis of this kind?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Turkey has vast infrastructure. It's something that the government prides itself on. And this is an area with a large mining infrastructure spread across a part of the country that is traditionally seen as quite favorable to Erdogan's Justice and Development Party. So this is something where the government is obviously prioritizing a huge amount of resources to make sure that this is a disaster that doesn't reach the proportions of previous mining disasters in the same part of the country. The question, and this is certainly something that Erdogan alluded to in, or spoke to quite directly when he tweeted a statement essentially warning people against spreading disinformation about this incident and saying that people should only follow official accounts of what happened, is how much responsibility was there for mine safety and what was alerted prior to the incident. So someone from the Turkish Court of Accounts, which is a kind of government audit group, also released a statement mentioning that someone from their organization had visited the mine recently, but they essentially said that reports that this was for some kind of audit or inspection purposes were also disinformation. So the information around the safety of the mine prior to this and whether anyone raised concerns is certainly very unclear, and the government seems to be quite concerned about what they would regard as disinformation about this incident.
Really good to get your expertise. Ruth Michelson there, a reporter for The Guardian, and we will continue to follow this story here on BBC World News.
Well, Russian state media sources are reporting the arrest of what are described as 8 suspects in connection with Saturday's explosion on the Kerch Bridge. The 12-mile-long bridge connects Russia to Crimea, the Ukrainian territory it annexed in 2014. Russian President Vladimir Putin personally opened the structure in 2018. Well, this is the blast and its aftermath. The Russian Federal Security Service says 5 Russian citizens and 3 people from Ukraine and Armenia had been detained. It also accuses Ukraine's main intelligence directorate of having organised the explosion. Ukraine has not admitted any involvement. Well, since the bridge explosion, there have been missile strikes in Kyiv and other cities. Prosecutors for international mobile justice teams, which include both the international and Ukrainian experts, say they are investigating the strikes as war crimes. There have been also more explosions reported on Wednesday in Kherson, Nikopol and Zaporizhzhia region. Well, our correspondent in Kyiv, Hugo Bachega, updated us on the developments over the past few hours.
Russia says it's detained 8 people in connection with the explosion that hit the Crimea Bridge on Saturday. It says it was a terrorist attack that was caused by a lorry explosion, and it has blamed the Ukrainian intelligence service for this explosion. The Ukrainians haven't acknowledged having any kind of involvement in this blast, and the spokesperson for the Ukrainian intelligence service said the statement by the FSB in Russia was nonsense. That explosion in Crimea triggered a wave of missile attacks by Russia that hit multiple cities across the country on Monday. 19 people were killed, more than 100 injured, as many cities came under attack, including here the capital, Kyiv. Yesterday, President Zelensky addressed a virtual summit of G7 leaders, and he asked for more air defense capabilities. He said this is the kind of technology, kind of equipment that the Ukrainians need to protect the country from the threat of Russian missiles. He also called on the West to find new ways to apply political pressure on Russia and support Ukraine.
Well, the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog has said he is deeply worried about the continued loss of power supplies to the atomic energy site at Zaporizhzhia. The Ukrainian reactors have been occupied by Russian forces and require a supply of electricity to function. Well, they're currently running on backup generators, but officials from Ukraine's state-run nuclear energy company say Russia is not allowing supplies of fuel to be delivered. Meanwhile, NATO defence ministers are gathered in Brussels for the start of 2 days of talks to discuss how to step up and sustain support to Ukraine as Russia escalates its attacks. The US and Germany have already said they'll provide advanced air defence systems after President Volodymyr Zelensky on Tuesday called for the West to help Ukraine create an air shield. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg spoke ahead of the meeting.
We have seen, of course, the speculations about the use of a low-yield nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And we have conveyed clearly to Russia that this will have severe consequences for Russia. Russia knows that the nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought. And we are, of course, also closely monitoring the Russian nuclear posture. We haven't seen any changes in the nuclear posture of Russia, but we will remain vigilant. We will continue to monitor closely because the nuclear threats, the nuclear rhetoric and the veiled threats from Russia are dangerous and reckless.
Well, let's cross live to Brussels with our correspondent Jessica Parker, who is there. And Jessica, what do leaders hope to achieve over the coming days?
Yeah, well, first up this afternoon, we've actually got a US-led contact group, as it's called, of around 50 nations to discuss support for Ukraine. And this is all a kind of pre-scheduled set of meetings. It's worth bearing that in mind. But obviously, following those attacks that we saw earlier this week with missiles raining down on Ukrainian cities, there has been this real focus on air defense systems. As you were mentioning before, President Zelensky of Ukraine calling for an air shield to protect civilian infrastructure across his country. Of course, I think that's widely recognized to bring challenges. Ukraine, a very large country, but I think part of the discussions will absolutely be this afternoon around that issue and what more countries can provide. As you say, we've had announcements from Germany and the United States. Whether other NATO ally countries might make further announcements, we'll have to wait and see. But also for NATO defence ministers, as they meet for dinner later today and continue on talks to tomorrow, something that they're looking at as well is their stockpile of weapons. So obviously a lot of resources has gone towards Ukraine. So there's a focus now on trying to increase targets and really gear the defence industry up for what is potentially a long haul in terms of this conflict.
And after the Russian attacks on civilian targets over the last few days, things have become more urgent, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, Jens Stoltenberg has talked about the sort of most serious escalation that we've seen in quite a long time since the start of this conflict. So I think there is that added sense of urgency. And then there's some other factors playing into this too, not just the attacks that we saw in Ukraine. There's also this issue of infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure. So that's also going to be forming part of the discussions. You'll remember, our audience will remember too, that the Nord Stream pipelines, whilst not in use, saw what many suspect was acts of sabotage. We don't know who was responsible for that, but there are lots of conversations about what resilience can be built in order to protect vital pieces of infrastructure over the coming winter.
Jessica, thank you very much.
Let's move to Ukraine now, which has endured a third day of Russian missile strikes. It's an escalation which US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin says lays bare the malice and cruelty of the war. Well, we'll be getting more on those attacks shortly. But first, let's take a look at the diplomatic developments. The Defence Secretaries of over 50 Western countries have been meeting at the headquarters of the NATO Defensive Alliance in Brussels. They have pledged to continue sending military hardware to Ukraine, they say, for as long as it takes. So that's a message echoed by the G7 group of powerful countries. Let's hear a little from Secretary Austin.
Ukraine's forces have used systems like HIMARS to change the dynamics of the war that Putin started. And that's helped Ukrainian forces seize the initiative during their counteroffensive. So we'll continue to rush in the capabilities to help Ukraine in the current fight. And I commend the contact group members who have moved heaven and earth to get weapons and equipment into the hands of the Ukrainian forces.
Well, we've also heard from Germany.
Germany has delivered a state-of-the-art defense system to Ukraine. It's important support for Ukraine in its fight against these missile attacks, this terror the population is being subjected to. It is one system, and next year another 3 of these air defense systems will follow.
Well, both pledges have been welcomed by the Ukrainian president. He has been calling for an air shield against future Russian attacks. Let's remind ourselves of what he said just on Tuesday.
I ask you to increase your joint efforts to help financially to create the air shields for Ukraine. Millions of people will be grateful to the Group of 7.
Well, we are expecting to hear more military pledges as this week goes on. But in the meantime, we have heard from France just in the past hour. President Macron has promised radar systems and also missiles for Ukraine. Then there's the Netherlands. They have promised over $14 million worth of missiles. Estonia has also outlined its commitments. Here is its defence minister speaking to the BBC.
First, we will give ammunition, which is still very much needed. And second part is the winter gear. So we will give two brigades full winter gear, clothing, everything added to that. And thirdly, we will also give the bulletproof vests for 3 brigades. So it's quite a lot considering our size and our possibilities, but it's not the time at the moment to think will it somehow affect also our own capabilities. We need to help Ukraine and we need to help them now as soon as possible.
The BBC has also been getting reaction from one Ukrainian MP.
I think it's important to understand that Russian Federation has been escalating its military attacks on Ukrainian civilians, on the civilian infrastructure. And that's why we are asking for really increased efforts from our partners to step up with their support with the air defense, but also with the weaponry that would allow us to conduct further the counteroffensives.
Let's also hear from Jessica Parker. She's at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, where that meeting has been taking place.
We heard from the Canadians earlier today. They're talking about providing winter hats, boots and gloves, just so frontline soldiers have the proper gear that they might need this winter as the conflict enters a new phase. And I think more broadly as well, in terms of how long this could last, countries are potentially digging in for the long haul in terms of trying to supply weapons to Ukraine, but also build up their own bases again or replenish their own weapons stocks. And so what you've heard quite a lot surrounding this summit is work ongoing with the defence industry to try and get that industrial base in a position to meet those demands longer term, as also you see countries pledging higher defence spending.
Well, we mentioned that Russian strikes have intensified over the past few days. I want to bring you a map showing you where they have been targeted. You can see the western city of Lviv, that's among the targets. It has rarely been hit before, apart from at the very beginning of the war. There's also been strikes in the capital, Kyiv, and these are the latest pictures we have for you from there. This is showing the aftermath. We've been hearing from a resident of Kyiv who lives there with her 3 children.
When the bombings began, I was about to take my kids to the dentist, and we were about to, drive this road that was hit by Russian missile. But we didn't drive there because there were explosions. So instead, I took them to the basement.
Now, another city we know that has been targeted is Zaporizhia, and there have been several explosions reported there. And that is important because the city is also home to an atomic energy site. Let's take a look at it. It's Europe's largest. It was captured by the Russians, you might remember, early on in the invasion, and the plant lost power earlier today. Now, although it has been restored, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency said the outage had been caused by shelling and damage to a substation, and that the situation there remains precarious. Well, a little earlier, the US president had this to say about the attacks.
What's your reaction to recent Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine?
Same as always, man. It's brutal. It's beyond the pale.
Hello and welcome. President Biden has promised to provide Ukraine with advanced air defense systems after the worst Russian attack on Ukrainian cities for months. His comments come after Russia launched more than 80 missiles at sites across Ukraine on Monday, including the capital Kyiv. Air raid sirens have gone off across Ukraine again, prompting fears that Russians could hit the country again. Many homes were reported to be among the sites targeted on Monday, along with healthcare facilities and schools. At least 14 people were killed. Paul Adams reports from Kyiv.
After months of quiet in the capital, the war is back. For 3 chaotic hours, the missiles kept coming. For one young woman already recording her own sense of shock, a narrow escape.
A major city in the south of the country.
My BBC colleague Hugo Bashega was broadcasting live when it all began.
They want panic and chaos.
They want to destroy our energy system. They are hopeless. The second target is people. Such a time, such goals were specially chosen to cause as much damage as possible. But we are Ukrainians. We help each other. We believe in ourselves. We restore everything that is destroyed.
Tourist locations were hit too. This, the city's famous glass bridge. At times, it felt like a city being punished in its favourite, most iconic places. For many, it meant a hasty return to bomb shelters not used for months.
They want to destroy our people, our infrastructure, everything. I really don't know, and I'm extremely angry, you know.
When Moscow decided it had done enough, it ended. The cleanup began. There are bodies lying on the street here in this elegant European capital. It's been almost 4 months since the last attack in Kiev. In 3 short hours, a growing sense of normality was shattered. This is the first time missiles have landed right here in the centre of Kiev. And these were not military targets. The children's playground through the trees, part of the University of Kiev over there. And this is a government department of science and education. Nearby, a huge crater in a place where children come to play. Olena and Valery live around the corner. Their children and grandchildren know this place well.
Oh, it's horrible. This is our life. And just now, I don't know, an abyss has opened up in our lives. It's terrible. We'll be more careful now. When the sirens sound, we'll go straight to the shelter.
And it wasn't just the capital. In the southern city of Zaporizhia, it was another hellish night. One of many in recent days. Another 14 civilians died in one apartment block. 10 missiles fell around Dnipro, one landing right in front of a bus. And far to the west, explosions in Lviv. This city hasn't been hit since the spring. Much of it is still without power. In Kiev's famously deep metro, they gathered and sang. People lived down here for weeks when the war began. 2 days ago, Ukraine was celebrating an attack on Russia's bridge to Crimea. That euphoria is gone. Fear, once again, stalking the capital. Paul Adams, BBC News, Kiev.
Let's talk to our correspondent Hugo Pichega, who's in Kiev. Hugo, welcome to you, and you're in the basement of your hotel there. Just explain what's been going on there today.
Yes, Samantha, it is just a little bit after 9 o'clock in the morning here, and about an hour ago the air raid siren went off here in Kyiv and across the country, and I think this is happening 24 hours after the attacks that hit cities across the country yesterday. So obviously there is the fear that more attacks can come. So people across the country, I think, are now in shelters and in underground bunkers as the air raid sirens have gone off across the country. And we saw from Paul Adams that I was broadcasting live from our position here in our hotel, and a missile struck very close to our hotel here in Kyiv. It was the first time since the very beginning of the war, really, that Kyiv was attacked. I think there was a feeling here that the city was relatively safe. There was a feeling of weird normal in a way, with restaurants and bars and cafes open, busy, and I think this feeling has been shattered, at least for now, as the city has come under attack again.
Yeah, and Hugo, the US have condemned what they've called a brutal Russian strike on Ukraine. They've promised more air defense systems. Ukraine does have those already, and they were somewhat effective yesterday, but how effective are they, and do we know the timings for when the US could deliver these?
Yeah, so the Ukrainians said that the Russians had fired 84 missiles, and the air defense system managed to shoot down 43 of them. But the Ukrainians for quite some time have been asking Western countries to provide air defense systems to protect those cities from these airstrikes from Russia. So we heard yesterday President Biden promising to deliver sophisticated air defense systems. I think Germany as well promised to speed up up the delivery of equipment. So this is something that's going to be welcomed by the Ukrainians here. And I think last night President Zelensky, in his traditional evening address, went to one of the locations that were targeted here in Kyiv. He delivered a very defiant speech saying that Ukraine wouldn't be intimidated. He actually said that Ukraine would strengthen its armed forces. But again, he said Russia had carried out strikes during the morning rush hour on purpose, and he said these were typical terrorist tactics.
Okay, Hugo, for now, thank you.
A wave of Russian missile strikes on cities across Ukraine has sparked international outrage. The most widespread bombardment since the beginning of the war is in retaliation for Saturday's explosion on a bridge connecting Russia with occupied Crimea. Take a look at this. Well, this girl was walking past Taras Shevchenko National University in a cultural district of Kyiv. She thankfully survived a near miss, but others were not so fortunate. This footage was captured close to the university as Ukrainian emergency services responded to the wounded. So far, 11 dead have been reported, 64 were wounded. Well, the district is also home to this playground. It and several museums, galleries and government buildings were damaged in the explosion. It is the first time that Moscow has targeted downtown Kyiv since the start of the war. The BBC has been speaking to residents near the blast site.
Oh, it's horrible. This is our life. And just now, I don't know, an abyss has opened up in our lives. It's terrible.
Well, the strikes in Kyiv began at 8 o'clock local time this morning. The first appeared to land in the direction of the so-called Glass Bridge. It's a Kyiv tourist attraction. This CCTV captures the bridge taking a direct hit. The BBC's Kyiv correspondent was reporting live at the time about Russia's potential response to the Kerch Bridge explosion.
So the fear is that this could trigger a very strong Russian response. We saw yesterday that a residential area of the city of Zaporizhia, a major city in the south of the country, very close to the front lines, was hit. More than a dozen.
Well, Kyiv was not alone. Zaporizhia, a city close to the front, was heavily targeted on Sunday. This 9-storey apartment block was partially destroyed. 5 other residential buildings were levelled and damaged, many more. Another 13 people were reported killed there. 87 were injured, including 10 children. In Dnipro, a bus driver and several passengers, they were injured when a missile struck just ahead of a city bus. And the major western city of Lviv was struck too. Their local officials report that critical infrastructure, including power and water facilities, were targeted.
They will do, and they have already targeted on critical infrastructure in order to the city to be without electricity, without water supply. Today we partly prepared because we use diesel generators, but of course, so we have to restart electricity in our city, and so in this work engage a lot of services in one moment, so all state services, all municipal services, all private services.
Well, cities across Ukraine were hit in the largest simultaneous barrage since the early months of the war. Cities across the country were targeted with specific focus on energy infrastructure. Power outages were reported in the frontline regions of Kharkiv and Sumy, and in 3 key regions in the west. Those areas have hosted significant numbers of refugees. Well, the Ukrainian Ministry of Energy has said it will now have to stop supplying electricity to the EU from tomorrow due to today's missile strikes. Well, according to the Ukrainian Air Defense, 83 missiles were fired by the Russian military against Ukrainian cities. It claims just over half were intercepted before reaching their targets. Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky issued a defiant message.
This morning is difficult. We are dealing with terrorists. Dozens of missiles, Iranian drones. They have 2 targets, the energy facilities throughout the country. They want panic and chaos. They want to destroy our energy system. They are hopeless. The second target is people. Such a time, such goals were specially chosen to cause as much damage as possible. But we are Ukrainians. We help each other. We believe in ourselves. We restore everything that is destroyed.
Well, according to the man who ordered the strikes, they will not be the last if Ukraine launches further attacks against what he claims is Russian territory. This shows the moment last week when an explosion struck the strategic Kerch Bridge, the only link connecting occupied Crimea and Russia. Kyiv has not taken responsibility for that attack, but Western intelligence experts say Ukrainian sabotage operation is a clear possibility. Well, Mr. Putin pointed the finger clearly at Kyiv. He's also claimed Russia's strikes targeted purely strategic objectives.
It is simply impossible to leave crimes of this kind unanswered. This morning, in line with suggestions given by the Defence Ministry and in accordance with the Russian General Staff's plan, a mass strike was launched with long-range, high-precision air, sea and land-based weapons against Ukraine's energy facilities, military commands and communications facilities. If attempts to carry out acts of terrorism on our territory continue, Russia's response will be harsh, and its scale will respond to that of the threat made against the Russian Federation. No one should be in any doubt about that.
Well, the attack on Ukraine has drawn widespread condemnation from the international community. The President of the European Commission, that's Ursula von der Leyen, says she's shocked and appalled by the vicious attacks on Ukrainian cities, adding that Putin's Russia has again shown the world what it stands for: brutality and terror. Meanwhile, the head of NATO has tweeted about what he describes as horrific and indiscriminate attacks and says the military alliance will continue supporting the brave Ukrainian people as long as it takes. Well, analysts have compared these Russian tactics to the bombing of urban centres during World War II. Those were designed to break morale of people there. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson has been assessing their effectiveness.
It simply doesn't work. Sure, it does a lot of damage to the power and water supplies, and we've been told that by this evening some of those will be mended, perhaps most of them will be mended, and we'll get the power and the water coming back again. So in terms of the damage it's done, it's pretty minimal, even though there has been an awful lot of damage. But what really happens always is that people's morale rises, and it just makes Ukrainians absolutely determined to keep on fighting.
Well, that determination clear. Another moment for the people of Ukraine to show their resilience. Here, civilians sheltering in a Kyiv metro station to keep up morale were singing a Ukrainian folk song. Well, Alexander Maroshnitchenko is a volunteer first responder. I spoke to him earlier as he described the scene in the capital, Kyiv.
I was just at my apartment spending time with my friends when we heard first explosions. And then we decided to move to the center of Kiev to assist with casualties, because we understand that it will be massive casualty. And when we arrived to the first spot, which was actually the university where my friend studied, so it was hit near the university, and there were probably died people and massive casualties, around 10 to 15 people. And then we decided to move straight to the park, which is pretty safe zone, and then we heard another explosion, which it was the hit of the civilian business center, the absolute civilian spot, and we rapidly ran there and saw really massive casualty. Around 20 to 30 people were laying there, and it was pretty hard casualties. So it's cut off legs, hands, shrapnel wounds. It was pretty hard for us to work with that amount of people who was actually casualties by the missile. And the hardest part, the mostly of them, there was ladies, and the ladies are 55 plus years old. So this were civilians who were just walking around the city and were so close to die because of just Russian terrorist state decided to throw the missile in the center of Kiev, and like non-military object. So yeah, it was pretty hard. This is civilian. When they told me that they moved from Donetsk and Luhansk 2 days ago just to survive, because their places where they used to live before are damaged and exploded totally, unfortunately. And they say that we came to Kiev to feel ourselves more safe, and we were close to die if you will not save us. So that's what we saw.
Yeah, and Alexander, everything you've told me there suggests that these were not in any way military targets. These were civilian populations, they were playgrounds, they were business centres, they were part of the university. Tell us a little bit about the sites themselves that seemingly were targeted here.
Yeah, the first one is university. So this is university where students, and I think the closest military object from there is probably 15 minutes by car. And this hit was straight on the middle of the road where only civilians were driving, and absolutely no military object. The second hit, this is the business center. I remember some companies, like worldwide companies, offices are there, and we came there, and we've not seen any military people there. Any. Yeah. Only later when people from military start coming there to work with the casualties and to save people, then we saw a couple of people from military, but mostly people who were helping the civilian people.
There's a desperate plea for global support to protect the world's animals and plants. It comes after a new report has shown that wildlife populations have fallen by nearly 70% since 1970. The Worldwide Fund for Nature says governments, businesses and the public must take action to reverse the destruction of biodiversity. Sean Dilley reports.
Striding with grace, content with its natural habitat in the Amazon, but maybe that's because this big cat doesn't understand the danger that lurks around the corner. The conservation charity, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, says the breakup of natural habitat and climate change means animal populations here are in particular danger. The charity's latest Living Planet report warns that global wildlife populations have fallen by nearly 70% in around 50 years. The study, which assesses the abundance of almost 32,000 populations of 5,230 species of animals, birds, reptiles, amphibians and fish around the world, suggests that population sizes declined by 69% on average between 1970 and 2018. Species living in freshwater lakes and wetlands have fallen by an average of 83%. The most impacted species live here in Latin America and the Amazon, where deforestation is destroying trees and the species who rely on them to sustain life. Wildlife population sizes here have fallen by 94% over the past half-century, according to the report. Other areas such as North America, Asia and Europe have seen a smaller decline, but climate change threatens species everywhere. The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, with just half of its nature richness remaining. The Worldwide Fund for Nature says it's now or never if we're to restore the natural world. The government says it's committed to halting the decline of nature by 2030 and that it will continue to improve on wildlife laws. But the WWF says it needs to act very quickly if it wants to protect species from danger and extinction. Sean Dilley, BBC News.
And we can get more now on that from the WWF, which has just released that report. Their UK Chief Executive Tanya Steele joins me now. Tanya, thank you very much for your time. That is a lot of loss in a very short time. Nearly 70% decline in just under 50 years. Put that in further context for us, Tanya.
I mean, this is our most comprehensive report ever, and it is a stark warning for us. If wildlife and its habitats don't survive, then neither will we. And if we were to treat the human population as one species that we were monitoring, it would be the equivalent of wiping out the entire populations of China, Europe, Oceania, the Americas combined. So this is a devastating set of impacts for our natural world. And probably what is even more devastating is that we have reported these declines repeatedly, but we have seen very little action from world leaders to start to halt this loss and to put it onto a path for recovery.
And in fact, you were telling me about this when we spoke at COP26 in Glasgow last year, Tanya. Since then, have you seen any plans, any initiatives from governments anywhere around the world that give you hope that someone's actually taking this seriously, really doing something about it?
I mean, I think that for the most part, many world leaders have been missing in action, and we really do need those leaders to act and galvanise now, because nature is the linchpin in the fight against climate change. You know, the loss of our natural world is shocking enough, but we have the greater peril of climate change really kind of heading to us at high speed. So to not address the loss in our natural world means we have no hope at all of reaching 1.5 degree targets. And we have a very short window of opportunity. There is a global leaders meeting in Montreal in December where a new action plan needs to be formed to really start to halt this loss of nature and actually start to recover it. And anything less than an agreement to do that would be an utter betrayal of future generations.
I'm just trying to understand why it isn't being taken seriously enough. I mean, yes, the words are all there, aren't they? People say we must do more to support our wildlife, our environment. But why is the time, the resources, the money, the energy not being put into the sort of plans that you want to see to help protect animals and plants?
I think really it's taken time to get this issue up the political agenda. But I mean, just the summer we've all experienced across the world, here in the UK with soaring temperatures of 40 degrees, wildfires across the whole of Europe, and biblical style floods, level floods in Pakistan are starting to bring this to the fore. And I think realistically, we know that this is not just an issue that affects the ecology of our world, it is affecting our economies and it is affecting our ability to function as a society. So we see this as an opportunity for world leaders to recognise that we cannot continue to kick the can down the road, and we have to actually focus on efforts beyond conservation, which are important, but actually start to reach into our supply chains, our economies, and really how we work, because we are destroying so much nature by the way we live and work and consume as human beings, and it is no longer sustainable.
Tanya, thank you very much for your time today. Tanya Steele, the WWF's UK Chief Executive.